Welcome, everyone. We have a packed room, which is nice. I want to welcome you to this talk from René about FHIR messaging and FHIR documents. Well, I hope you had a good lunch. I'm just chatting till everyone finds a spot. Coming from everywhere, that's good. There's still a few chairs here. And otherwise, you'll exercise your legs and you have to stand a bit. You're free to have a seat here if you want. Okay, René is going to start his talk in, I think, 30 seconds. I'll be the moderator today, and I'll get back to you for Q&A. If you have questions afterwards, please wait for me to be with you with the mic. Then everyone can hear the question. But first, let's listen to René.
Right, yes, welcome. This session tries to tackle the misconception that FHIR equates REST. And that's something that a lot of people who know something about FHIR, and they have played around with Postman, and they have created resources and retrieved some stuff, FHIR equates REST. But that's very much not true. FHIR was even created in such a way that the reusable FHIR resources, you would be able to use them to also support other exchange mechanisms, such as messaging, the oldest exchange mechanism that we support since the 1950s or something, very old mechanism, and documents. Document mechanism, well known from CDA, for example, the Clinical Document Architecture, or CCDA here in the US. So this session tries to convey and basically inform you when you should consider some of the other options. I'm not saying that REST is not going to be the prime option for most people, because it will be used and is used in at least 90% of all implementations. But there is more than just that. Yes, we have 4 exchange mechanisms in FHIR. And REST 90% plus. We use the very same FHIR resources to construct messages, and we cannot use the very same FHIR resources in documents, FHIR documents, that is. And obviously, if you look at services, well, you can do absolutely everything with services, but then obviously you can also use FHIR resources as payloads. One of the key things is that regarding of how you are going to exchange the data, whether it's going to be REST or documents or messages, the resources are one and the same. So if I have, let's say, a laboratory system that creates a FHIR message with a lab result, and that's something that's relatively well suited, as we will see, to messaging, then we can yank the resources out of that message effectively and store them in a persistence layer, some FHIR CDR or something. Then using REST, which is very suited to the exchange of individual FHIR resources with a repository, I can manipulate or view that data. And once my process has been completed, then I can decide to, for example, create a lab result report. And reports are quite often, documents are summative in nature, so they lend themselves for exchange with other organizations or even on a nation or regional scale. But they're all built on the very same FHIR resources. That's a patient resource and a patient resource and a patient resource. And they all would use the exact same profile. US core, US core, US core, right? So at least we have that. In older versions of HL7, we had wildly different models across these different exchange mechanisms. Here in FHIR, they're the same. We're giving you options, whilst retaining the possibility to use the very same resources and the very same profiles. So when should you use REST? This is not a session where we're going to bash REST or something. This is just to show you the other options. When to use REST? Well, if you have these simple atomic exchanges of one single FHIR resource and you're supporting a workflow, use REST, by all means. which means if you are doing app development, this is actually a very suitable protocol to use. Right? If you look at this and you go like, this is client-driven, by the way. So in principle, if you use REST, then what the client says goes. If the client says delete, then the server will delete, assuming you have proper access control rights and all that sort of stuff. But in principle, the client is in the driver's seat, as opposed to some of the other options that we're going to see in the future. For example, documents. Documents have an entirely different focus. When it is about documents, then we're talking about persistence, long-term archival. You don't know if a document is going to be read 10 minutes from now by a colleague of yours, or maybe 30 years from now by a general practitioner somewhere else in the country. You have no idea. So persistence is a focus here, as is narrative. Human readability is mandatory. And after all, in healthcare, it's all about the humans. We want provider-to-provider interoperability between humans. It's the same idea behind the clinical document architecture. Human readability at the forefront. And there is no workflow support here. Let's say you have a document and you put a prescription in there. And you send it somewhere with FHIR. Then the receiver says, oh yeah, thank you, archive. But it doesn't mean do something. There is no workflow control in a document. It's a bit like if you have a prescription in a PDF and you send it by email, and you send it in a 2 to 1 specific pharmacy, and in a CC to 5 other pharmacies, then you're telling the receiver, outside of the document itself, you have to do this, and for the others, you can just archive this and not do anything. So there is no workflow control in documents. So if you need that, then documents probably not something you can use. Multiple resources, obviously, if you talk in terms of FHIR. Now, given that we have the mandatory narrative in there is an element of tension here, because we need some data to be there in a computable fashion for software processing, and other data is going to be there in text. Maybe text only. So there's a duality between the two. And there's actually a challenge here of a bit of an element of tension. Because on the left-hand side, clinicians love that. I have text. Great, flexible, I can do everything I want. Now, the handwriting may not be terribly legible, and it's in German actually, so that doesn't necessarily help this audience. Right? But there is some structure in there. Like here we have a list of medications. So this medication here should be taken once after breakfast, 0 after lunch, and 0 after dinner. There is structure in here. Okay? But most of us, if you are and have an informatics background or you're a programmer, you go like, text. I need structure. I want the equivalent of this, like a drop-down list, and I give you codes, and you have to choose one of the 5 options. And then the clinical people go like, it takes time. Who cares about that? Unless it's relevant for billing, right? But anyway, that is an aside. But if we do that as programmers, we go like, okay, we'll create this interface. Then the first things that clinicians will say when they see this is, where's my text field? And they're right. You cannot code and structure everything. So as a programmer, you go like, okay, so I'll add a text field to here. Okay, so how is then subsequently this user interface used? They only use the text field. And the nice thing is, wherever around the world I ask this semi-rhetorical question, I get the exact same answer. So there is an element of tension here between the flexibility of text and the necessity to have a certain amount of coded content for software processing. Now, from a FHIR perspective, how do you structure a document? Now, it's a bundle. You know about bundles, right? Bundles are collections of individual FHIR resources. And the key resource here is, besides the bundle that contains all of these resources, is the composition resource. The composition resource is something like the CDA header. It contains the metadata for the document. When was the document written? What's the associated patient? What's the document type? That's the metadata that we have in the document. Plus, sections with human-readable text. And that human-readable text can then be enriched, you see that here through this reference, with FHIR resources that contain the computable expression of that same content that's already in the text. So let's assume that we have somehow created this web of interlinked FHIR resources using REST. So we have this sitting in our CDR. And now we're going to create a document for the second encounter. And it's an encounter, as you can see, between Adam Everyman and Dr. Hippocrates. And in the second encounter, we have a prescription, we have an allergy, and some other stuff. So we're going to create a discharge letter for this second encounter. Obviously, we're going to reuse the FHIR resources we already have in our CDR. We're not going to capture that again, right? So what you do is to create this structure. The outermost box represents the bundle. Then we have the composition, which has a couple of sections, and each section, that's a repeating part of the FHIR resource, has the textual summary. So we have human readability, check. That's the minimalistic requirement. And we have the meta information. There's some data elements here and references to the patient and encounter and the author, which is Hippocrates. And then next to the text in the section, we have references to the underlying FHIR resources for software processing. Now, very interesting that the American College of Physicians made a position paper a couple of years back and said, structured data should be captured only where it's necessary for particular reasons, and otherwise use text to structure conversion. That was a pretty strongly worded statement. And obviously, all vendors in the room, you have followed it up. You're all doing natural language processing, right? Right? No, we're not, right? So we're slowly getting there. Especially in English, this is getting reasonably good. In my language, or a lot of other languages, we don't have enough training material to have a decent quality of transformation. So let's say we have these blood pressure values, 120/80, systolic, diastolic, easy, right? So we store that in our databases to, let's say, integers. Then we turn that into a section in this document. But then we only have the computable expression, 120 and 80, but we don't have the text. So some programmer will have to create a script to create a nice-looking table or a sentence or whatever to express the fact that blood pressure is 120/80. And I can actually see that the text was automatically generated because here is a special code that says this text is based on the underlying structure. And this is actually fairly standard nowadays. We generate the text from the structure. But what clinicians would like to do is the other way around. I type or I dictate or some other way of doing fancy data entry, patient with onset of asthma in his teens, throw in the database as a text, generate my section in the document, and then I have text. Hey, presto, document requirement is there shall be text. Cool, I have that. But then everybody goes like, yeah, well, it would be kind of nice if at least the word asthma were somehow enriched with a diagnosis code for asthma. That's where the natural language parsing comes in. And I've seen these applications where it was not entirely done with natural language parsing, and then it would pop up on your screen, and then it would ask, you just typed the word asthma. There are 27 types of asthma in SNOMED. Which one is it? But these things are smart. So if you're writing a discharge letter, and somewhere above in the discharge letter, it has a list of medications, pulled from medical record or something, and you then have the word asthma, then it realizes, oh, wait a second, with that medication is only prescribed for 3 types of asthma, so I'll still give you the list of 27, but the 3 most likely ones will be near the top. Okay, so there are various ways of doing this. To enrich, as you see here, create the computable version of that data. But now my code here is going to say additional. There is additional information in the text above and beyond what's there in the structured data. For example, in his teens, that's not captured in our structured data. Maybe we could, but it's not in this example. Now, the nice thing about documents is that they're very easy to display because there is this human readable part in there. So again, to stress the importance of human readability. This is one of the reasons why large-scale projects tend to like documents, because if you have differences in the level of IT usage, for example, across the European countries, they have widely different IT maturity levels, then this is a nice way to basically ensure that we still have interoperability between humans. So that's documents. In messaging, the oldest of our exchange mechanisms dates back from the 1950s. That's a while ago by now, right? And messaging is basically relatively pessimistic. I do not assume when I send a message to you, a bundle of information, that you have ever heard from me before. I'm not assuming that you've ever heard of this patient before. But that means if I send you a message, I have to have a very rich bucket load of content, because I don't know what you already know. And it's up to the receiver to decide if what they're going to actually process. They make a selection as to what they actually are going to process. And key here is that it's trigger event based. A trigger event in this case is some stage in the business workflow. So I'm registering the patient, and once I've registered the patient in my EHR or wherever, push a button, patient is now officially admitted, trigger event, do a broadcast to everybody, to whom it may concern, patient Smith has been admitted, right? And you get a bucket load of information. So this allows for synchronization of back-end databases. That's where this mechanism is very suitable for. Trigger event based. It's always going to be a message and a response. So there's always going to be a response by definition. You have the trigger events. These are predefined in the specification or in your implementation guide. They document what the points in time are, or the points in the workflow when data is exchanged. And each of these trigger events has a different set of FHIR resources associated with it. You can imagine that if the trigger event were to be new lab result, I need a different collection of FHIR resources than if my trigger event is patient has been admitted. So you need to define those in your spec or implementation guide. And there's always going to be some form of response, an acknowledgement, and the transport mechanism is not predefined. You could use HTTP, you could use SOAP, you could use smoke signals, for all I care. Doesn't have a terribly very good bandwidth, but it will work. So how does this look like in terms of FHIR structure, FHIR resources? Well, again, we have a bundle of type message in this case, and it has a special FHIR resource called message header. And again, that's kind of the metadata. Who's the sender? Who's the receiver? What's the trigger event? When did that trigger event happen? And this is new for those of you that know HL7 version 2. That doesn't have this. That's also a messaging exchange mechanism. If the trigger event says new prescription, then there is a focus reference that references the new prescription. So related to the trigger event, you can then kind of zoom in, just like I'm doing now, that, new observation, then this is the new observation, right? But you get this bucket load, this collection of stuff in the message. Now, these trigger events, as I said, have to be defined in the specification. We used to have this list, which is a very high-level list, in the international FHIR spec, but now it's left to the implementation guides. So the FHIR release 4 has an empty value set there. So it's left to the implementers. And some implementers actually just copy over the list of trigger events that we already had in HL7 version 2. hey, we have the same business workflow, so it's the same points in time, but now we're sending not version 2 messages, but we're sending FHIR messages. In general, when it comes to messaging, you have 3 styles of exchanges. You have messages of notification. Something happened in my system and I'm doing the broadcast. Smith has been admitted, right? To allow you to synchronize your database with whatever happened in my system. Or something that we equate with REST, kind of a query response mechanism. And actually in messaging that doesn't happen that much. Okay, so if you have a lot of query response type mechanisms, then the REST is probably the better option than messaging. But there is some of that, certainly, even in messaging. And finally, the most complex one is a message of consequence. For example, sending a laboratory order. I want you to do something. I want you to execute a workflow. Okay? And if that then leads to a lab result, for example, I'm ordering a lab test, and it leads to a lab result, then the lab result itself is a message of notification. Ooh, I suddenly have this new lab result. Notification, I'm going to do a broadcast to whom it concerns, new lab result. Queries, if you're going to do them with messaging, you may know about FHIR has this parameters resource. Questions will be at the end, just to please hang on with the questions. Right, so queries, we have a parameters resource, and that's what you use for operations and for some other stuff in FHIR. So if you have a query message, then it's just the message header, and the only payload that we have, the body, is effectively just a bunch of search parameters. So you can do search with messages. Let's go back to our example, Adam Everyman. Let's assume we have this already in our CDR somehow. And now we're going to create a prescription, okay? So here we have a prescription, which is formally speaking a medication request FHIR resource for, it's always a tongue twister for me, erythromycin, right? And let's create a message for that. Dear community pharmacy over there, I want you to basically deal with this prescription. There's workflow here. Messaging does support workflow. How does it look like? Well, we have our message header, and the trigger event says new prescription. Then we have our sending organization and the receiver, which is the practitioner. We have the medication request, that's the focus. If the trigger is a new prescription, then the focus is the new prescription resource. In this case for erythromycin. And we have other FHIR resources because I'm not assuming that that pharmacy has ever heard about this patient before. So it could potentially be much richer than this, depending on legal requirements and all that sort of stuff. But here, certainly we're going to mention that the reason for prescribing was an ear infection, and it would be kind of nice to inform the local pharmacy that this patient has an allergy for penicillin. Okay, I guess that's kind of nice for them to be aware about that. So messaging, if you have request-response workflows, that's certainly something I'm messaging. If you need more complex stuff, it's asynchronous, and this is server-side orchestration, remember. It's up to the receiver, the server, to decide what they're going to process. We once had a server, and it was a gynecology system, 20 years ago, and it basically had a filter, and it says, well, all messages related to males, throw them away. Nowadays, that's not that easy anymore, but you get my drift. It's up to the server to decide when and what to process. Services, well, you can mimic absolutely everything with services. So all of the above, if you really want to do that. Services, as you may know, FHIR actually has quite elaborate level of services, and they're called operations. So FHIR operations are effectively services. And we use the same resources, obviously, as payloads. Now, if you would like to get additional details on all of this, in the FHIR specification itself, we have, on the front page, we have a set of exchange descriptions. So it's the REST API and search, RESTful search, documents, messages, And there are some additional things in there around not just services, but also how do I store this in a database. But to me, that's not an exchange mechanism. But it depends on your viewpoint. So that's where you can find additional details on this. So I hope by now that you are aware of all of the 4 exchange paradigms that we have in FHIR. And you may not always have the choice. There are some projects, for example, in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, where all they had was messaging. Version 2 messaging, DICOM is also messaging. So they didn't really have a choice. Their use of FHIR would have to be messaging. Okay? But you can share between the different paradigms. If you have the choice, I do this in documents and this in messaging and this in REST, then generally you can just transform the resources from one to the other. Right? So I hope you have seen and that you now know what the best features, what the characteristics are of those 4 different exchange mechanisms and when to use which exchange mechanism. Because that's the key message that I try to convey here. And yes, or no rather, FHIR does not equate REST. With that, it's time for questions. And the gentleman here with the red shirt has his hand up for a long while, so let's start there.
Yeah, hi. If you go back to, I believe it was slide number 18.
18? There we go.
Yeah, so here the first type you're saying message of notification. And how does that differ from FHIR subscription node where the type is message channel? Like how does this differ from that?
Well, the interesting thing is that mostly when we do messaging, there is an implicit subscription mechanism or an out-of-bounds subscription mechanism. I call you and I tell you, please send me messages of certain events. But that's mostly currently done by email or over the phone or something, but you could make it explicit by using a subscription. I want to subscribe to your new patient admit events and then send me a FHIR message. That's already supported in FHIR today. So I agree with you. That, at least in that sense, that we have an implicit subscription, I call you, or we have an explicit subscription, electronically at least, by using the subscription mechanism in FHIR itself.
Yeah, René, okay. In fact, I have a similar question as this gentleman. In fact, it's because like the messaging paradigm based on the HS7 FHIR website, in fact, the implementation is, in fact, also is extended operation called $process message, right? No. So I'm trying to find what's the difference, because the same messaging paradigm we can also achieve through the extended operation. You define the input parameter, which means you can take a multiple resource, then of course the response back. So I just see what's the rationale we still have the so-called messaging paradigm. Because it come to implementation, it still will come to the, RESTful API implement like process message, extended operations.
Well, the thing is that, I talked about that, for messaging, you could choose to use HTTP as a transport mechanism. If you choose to use HTTP, and nothing in FHIR says that you should do so, then you can use the $process message operation, which is not further detailed in the specification at all. It's sort of a magic label. This is the operation. You push your message to it, but you as a receiver, you have to build the operation. That's the complex part. So you could choose to choose something else if you want to. As for the other one, obviously we have operations and you can have bundles. Basically push a bundle as an input parameter to an operation, but that's not the same as a message. Because if you push a bundle to an operation, then your expectations are different. It's not server-side orchestration, right, by default. There is no trigger event mechanism, okay? And all of these things, trigger events are very important for processing. Something happened at your side, which means I have to do something specific related to that trigger event. So I just sent you a bucket load of resources, you go like, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? So to me, that's a bit of a difference. But yes, operations are the mechanism here, it's more of a transport mechanism. And how you implement that operation is not detailed in the FHIR specification itself.
Yeah. Because we are more thinking about, wouldn't it be better to...
Wait a sec.
Just like sometimes because from the IT implementation perspective, provide too much permutation, for example, like a service paradigm, messaging paradigm, RESTful paradigm. In fact, this will people remember the past history, HSM v3 messaging paradigm, document paradigm, right? So this where some of the things, you know, some of the like a doubt, overcomplicated. Would that be just simplify everything, just RESTful, provides extended operations?
Okay, well, let me tell you a story. CDA, it's a bad example. Well, it's a good example, we can learn from it. CCDA. CCDAs are effectively used as messages. It's fully automatically, you grab stuff out of your CDR, you just dump it into this bundle thing, you send it to a receiver and they take it apart. That's not a document if you have listened to me. Documents are about persistence. You don't yank stuff out of a document. A document is. You cannot take stuff out of its context. If you want to do that, that's messaging. I'm only trying to say that if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So we have seen a lot of implementations in the US where, oh, we only have CCDA. Everything has to be CCDA. I've seen CCDAs that were all about, patient has moved from bed 1 to bed 2. We create a CCDA for it. And I go like, no! So that's like painting yourself in a corner. If you go like, I'm only ever going to do REST. That's not a good answer. I'm only ever going to do messaging. No, that's not. You have to be aware that at least in some circumstances, you may have to use, by all means, choose REST. That's 90% of everything that's out there when it comes to FHIR. But just be aware, don't paint yourself into a corner. Sometimes you still are going to use and need FHIR documents and or FHIR messages. And whoever knows what else exchange mechanisms are going to be invented in the next 30 years. In healthcare, we have long timelines. I always try to impress on people, at least in my country, there's certain elements of data that you have to store 110 years and make sure that electronic data, that's still something people can process 110 years from now. That's a timeline that you have to keep in mind. And we don't. We humans, we cannot deal with a time span like that. So be flexible.
More questions?
Yeah, my question would be, how would you differentiate the resources which are more in the workflow area towards like the message exchange mechanisms? Because I would say that, like for example, the task resource is also like an kind of message exchange.
That's an interesting question. How do we drive workflows? And in the RESTful paradigm, you would indeed use mostly a task resource to do that. That's a nice plug, by the way, because later today I have a session on laboratory order workflows, and I will be talking about task. Okay, so if you want to know about the details, show up there. But yes, there are a few different ways to kick off a workflow. And in a message, that means I'm going to send a new laboratory order trigger event with lots of details to the receiver, and they will know, like the 2 in my email, you got to do this. So that then drives your workflow in the messaging paradigm. But that doesn't exist. This implicit workflow kickoff doesn't exist in the RESTful paradigm. So there you need something like task. There are a few nuances to that, but that's the bulk of what the answer should be about, I think.
Are there more questions?
In V2, you used to have some abstract message, abstract definition. You need to say, okay, I need to say this patient was admitted, and okay, I need to go to chapter 3 and select this message, and this message has this structure with this segment and all this stuff. In FHIR, I think it's quite different, but I don't know. You decide which a resource you include in your message, or is already defined? And
just like
put it in I don't know.
FHIR is using an HL7 version 2 analogy, but yes, even in FHIR messaging, it's very much the same. So you have an implementation guide. The implementation guide defines the trigger event. It also defines what FHIR resources shall, should, or may be included in the message scope.
And you use operation definition, a message definition to use that?
Yes, there is a special conformance resource or definitional resource, message definition, that allows you to specify that.
Thank you.
We are still good in time, so there's room for more questions.
Hi, so if I have a use case where I'm synchronizing, say, an application, say an oncology application, with that cohort from a hospital, what would you recommend using for transport? REST or messaging? Say it's 1 million patients, right? That might get updates over a month.
Well, synchronization is not a strong enough use case to make that determination. I would say normally REST out of the box. It depends on, do you want real-time synchronization, near-time synchronization, 24-hour delay, is that sufficient? Do I have a CDR that holds messages or documents, or is it just REST? So there's all those factors that come into play. So there is no perfect answer based on that minimal data. So
yeah. Today we stick with REST for 24-hour lag is fine, but we are seeing, I think I have to look into bulk APIs a bit, because we are definitely seeing a lot of taxing of the.
Okay, let me give you another example. Maybe we're coming up to time, I don't know.
No, but you're still good, René.
It was a volumetric reason. The NHS England again, so that's a large part of Great Britain. And they have a national infrastructure, secure infrastructure, and every morning at 8:15, they were looking at the traffic, and then at 8:15, the traffic each and every day went like. So they saw the huge peak, and then it lasted perhaps 20 minutes, and then it went down to the normal level again. And they were going like, what's this? I mean, FHIR exchanges, we're already doing that, but we're seeing this huge peak. And then they started doing some research, and they found out that what happened was that the medical secretaries came in the morning, they started the morning shift, and they were pooling for all the patients that had an appointment on that particular day. They were then sort of retrieving via FHIR all sorts of data for those patients across the country and from centralized EHRs, and pulling all of that data. REST is very chatty. If you need to pull an EHR for a patient, you go like, if you do this the stupid way, that's so to speak, that's rather chatty. So they decided purely for that reason to go for messaging. Because if you do messaging, then it's a bundle that has lots of stuff. They could have gone for operations or choose some other thing, but in England, just like in some other countries, they're well familiar with messaging. So they went for the messaging option, pure for volumetric reasons, to get this blip to be less high and less load on their interface. So even that can be a reason to go for, well, I'm going to do messaging instead of REST or whatever.
We have still 7 more minutes, so this is your chance, guys. I'll come back to you.
There's always more questions than we can answer, but I'll be here all week, so feel free to approach me if you want to.
Hey, thanks. When using messaging to synchronize data between two systems, you can run into a situation where you get this loop. I'm just curious, what are best practices to terminate these infinite loops of replicating data?
Well, I would say if you implement your messaging environment well, there should never be a loop. Because a trigger event that's imported from some other system, well, may cause changes to happen in my system, but it will never cause the same trigger event to happen. So there's no way you can technically avoid that if you have a bad implementation.
Well, there are two systems that are both generating data, and they're both interested in sharing data with each other. And so we don't know which system is going to create the patient. It could come in from here, it could come in from there. And then the question is, how do we stop continually using subscriptions to continually replicate this data back and forth?
Yeah, well, subscriptions is, it's an interesting conundrum. In other words, I don't know the answer. But that's always, if you're trying to break a loop, you have to build some safety mechanisms in there to avoid this. I agree with you. But that's not particularly a messaging question. I mean, that could happen in REST and with all sorts of exchange mechanisms. So.
I can add a comment.
Give me a sec. I'm having an obstacle run here.
This is not the morning run, but the afternoon run.
So we had a similar discussion in our company, and we found that within the FHIR resource, you have this meta tag, and I think one of the attributes supported is _source.
Source, yes.
Yeah, so if every system that is generating, it can tag it that this is the source, right? So you have to come up with a naming convention, and then you can add that to the header, or you can filter based on that.
Yes, either use source or maybe the provenance resource to record where something came from. And that could be of importance on the receiving end to decide whether or not to use that as to push it out via subscription again. It's certainly a mechanism that would be relevant here.
Yeah, René, can you go back to slide 16?
16? I have to go all the way. So should I go back to slide 1, perhaps? But it's,
Yeah, so that if within the bundle it contains, let's say, the content resource, let's say patient observation encounter. So as an implementation requirement, the focus element of the message header is mandatory. Is that correct?
Yeah, you have to have a focus.
Right.
You have a trigger event, so you have to have a focus associated with that trigger event.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
All right.
Is there any relation between document reference and the composition FHIR resource?
Yes.
And what are the best practices for using those in conjunction with each other?
The thing is that they're both essentially metadata, although not exactly the same scope. But let's say your document is not a FHIR document, but your document is a PDF. Then you need all the metadata to be in the document reference. Whereas if you have a FHIR document, then part of the metadata will be both in the document reference and it will also be in the composition. So there is an overlap of metadata in that very specific case.
Hi. You talked about 4 paradigms, right? Back to slide maybe 1. I don't know how far back. That's REST, documents, messages, and services. Now, if you look at 3 of them, right, REST, messages, and services, they fall into one kind of category, whereas documents is a separate category. Documents are equally applicable in all these other categories. Documents are equally applicable in all these other categories. I don't think they're equivalent when you're comparing them like that.
Well,
any thoughts?
They're not equal. As you have seen on the front page of the specification, they also regard the databases as an exchange mechanism. To me, that doesn't work. I agree with you that they're slightly different, because if you have a document, you would also have some other wrapper around it. You would have a message around it, or you would have an email with a to and a CC, which is another wrapper around it. So documents as such are not transported that way. There's always some wrapper around it. So yeah, I know what you're getting at. It's not exactly the same, but in this list of options, it's close enough to talk about it as if it is an equivalent type of option.
I see another question, but I'm very sorry. We are through the time. But as René said, he will be here, probably here now, but also for the rest of the 4 days. So yeah, feel free to reach out and go there. I want to ask you, if you have feedback for this session, you help us a lot by filling it in. The QR codes on the door bring you to the feedback form. And thanks for your attention.